Let me first welcome Mr. Amitabh Kant, who needs no introduction. And he has been entrusted with the simple task of leading the Indian G20 presidency at a time which is also rather cozy, as we heard last evening. The world doesn't seem to agree on anything. Big powers are fighting. Contest and confrontation is the norm. The pandemic has crippled many economies. The collaterals of energy insecurity, commodity prices, food insecurity are all beginning to pile on to national anxieties. And in this very happy moment, we will be taking over charge of the G20. Weaponization of everything, as someone mentioned last evening, is a moment when bodies like this become more important. And can the G20 in some ways restore a degree of order, a degree of balance, and perhaps even a forward-looking agenda that may not yield immediate results, but at least corrects the tone for the days ahead. What we have decided to do today is that we will perhaps pose a few questions to Mr. Amitabh Kant, and we'll also invite all of you to join in. And we want this to be an interactive session. So what I can start by saying is that I heard three things last evening in this high-level panel that we hosted as an inaugural one. One viewpoint was that the world is too complex, too fraught with all sorts of dangers, and we should be setting the expectations low. And a family photo of all the 20 leaders is perhaps a good outcome. That was one line of thinking as a G20 outcome. The second was more bullish, that perhaps it's a watershed, there is a time for resurgence, and maybe since we have plunged to the depths, the only direction is up, and we can perhaps instill some of the India energy around technology, around green transitions, around SDGs into the G20 framework and use this moment to plant the India story as a global story and take it forward. And I think no one is a better storyteller than you in India, from God's own country to incredible India. You have told stories your entire career, in many ways narrated the changes and transformations. So how do you see this moment? And where do you see the India story in this new role that India will be moving into soon?
Thanks, Samir. Let me first say that this is a world of uncertainty. I mean, this is a post-COVID era. There's the Russia-Ukraine war. Global supply chains are in disruption. You have the challenge of climate adaptation and mitigation. But I've always believed that every challenge is an opportunity, and therefore India must utilize this opportunity. I also feel that this is an opportune time actually to bring, as America gets into recession, I think it's very important that we bring growth center stage. Without accelerated growth, it will not be possible to lift people above poverty line. It will be very difficult to push for sustainability. And therefore, it's about accelerated growth with sustainability as the challenge of climate change. Also, to my mind, both if G20 is not able to push it with 85% of the global GDPs, almost 75% of the global trade, if G20 cannot take the leadership, you can't have consensus building in the United Nations. It's too large a body. You can't have it in G7 because it's a very small body. It's just of developed nations. And therefore, G20 comprises of both the developed world and the emerging markets. And therefore, this is a great, great opportunity. There's no other body which can bring out a consensus between the developed and the developing world as G20 can. And I think India, unlike many other countries, so right now we are at Indonesia. Frankly, my view on Indonesia is that their ambitions are very low, but that's they're looking at more as a means to push travel and tourism to Indonesia. But there's no reason why India's ambition should be low. We should try and accelerate the pace of growth. We should try and push sustainability. But along with that, I think this is a huge opportunity to push the India narrative. India has done incredibly well in a vast range of area, in digitization, in digital payments, in the spread of size and scale in a large number of development schemes and making an impact on poverty at the grassroots level. India is the only country amongst the large countries, is the only country which was able to achieve its NDC targets 9 years ahead of schedule. Its performance on renewable energy track has been really outstanding. This is a massive opportunity to spell out the India narrative across the different working groups and in the finance track. You will never get this opportunity again. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity, and India should fully utilize this opportunity. So, more than that, I think you have about 190 events spread across the country, the length and breadth of the country. So it's not just about putting people in hotels, it's about creating a great, unique Indian experience from the point of arrival to the point of departure. And how do you build that, a great, unique Indian experience to the travelers of the world? I mean, you're going to get all the cream de la cream of the world here. So how do you do that? All this is a huge opportunity in terms of content creation, in terms of India narrative, in terms of making it extremely experiential, and in terms of really establishing that India is a country which is going to be aggressive about it.
Mr. Kant, you have mentioned at one of our earlier discussions, maybe at the Raisina dialogue, if I remember, that there is no dearth of capital. You said there's no dearth of money. It is the transmission lines that need to be built. Now, how important is the role of G20 in really being able to mobilize global savings and deploy them to infrastructure creation, to the green transitions, to technology proliferation? And do you think there is a role here for us as at the G20 to build these transmission lines, to create these new funnels for cash to flow?
So first and foremost, I think, Samir, is very important that India needs to grow. India needs to grow at high rates, and India must have the ambition to grow at rates of 9 to 10% per annum, year after year, year after year, year after year, for 3 decades or more. There's a massive compounding power of the growth process if you grow at those rates, at high rates. And there's a huge difference between growing at 6%, growing at 8%, and growing at 10%. There's a massive difference which people must realize. That growing at 6% is vastly different from growing at 10%. Growing at 8% and growing at 10% is vastly different. And we should also realize that countries in the world have done this. Japan much earlier, subsequently Korea, Taiwan, China have done that and transformed themselves within 1 generation. And therefore, India must have that ambition to transform itself and grow at high rates within 1 generation. Now, if you want to transform yourself within 1 generation, it can't be done without radical reforms across a range of sectors, and it can't be, as the Prime Minister has repeatedly said, it can't be done by government alone. Government has to act as a facilitator, as a catalyst to bring in ease of doing business. But it's private sector which has to drive growth, and private sector driving growth would mean several things. Opening up your economy, ensuring that asset monetization is done, private sector manages it, bringing in private-public partnerships, ensuring that we create opportunities for private sector to drive India's growth. That's number 1. Secondly, it will not happen if you continue to grow in your traditional sectors of growth, because traditional sectors of growth are not the ones which are driving global economy. There's a massive disruption which has taken place in global economy, and it's new sectors of electric mobility, battery storage, semiconductors, mobiles. Those are the sectors in which global trade is taking place. It's not taking place in textiles. It's not taking place in food processing, which India sometimes gets over obsessed with. So it's very important to drive sectors which are penetrating global economy. Thirdly, it's very important to understand this, that India can keep spending vast amount of money in agriculture and in rural development and Manrega, but the global growth, India's growth story, India firstly while it employs an excessive amount of labor in the agriculture sector, and it will not happen unless and until good quality jobs are not created through a process of manufacturing and urbanization, and good sound urbanization. So India has got a huge opportunity, because we are at the beginning phase of our urbanization, to do good sound urbanization, which is on the back of public transportation. If you're going to get 500 million people into the urbanization process, this is a huge opportunity. And similarly, in some of the sunrise areas of growth, and that will enable you to get capital. It will not enable, private sector will not be able to get capital unless and until, if you do not go digital, if you do not go green, you will not be able to get capital, you will not be able to attract valuation. This is not possible. Today's world, you are working in a market area where capital can only be attracted if you are digitizing and if you are actually becoming a leader in climate change. And therefore, the new areas of growth, it's very, very important that private sector of India and the government creates the environment where we are able to get into those critical areas of growth. Advanced chemistry, cell battery, there's a huge disruption happening. Electric mobility, huge disruption happening. Renewable energy, huge disruption happening. Green hydrogen, massive disruption happening. Smartphone manufacturing, huge disruption happening. I mean, these are areas which we must understand where we are going. And we must also understand that despite all this talk of global supply chain disruption, America's imports from China during 2019 to 2021 have actually grown by about 14.8%. They've not slowed down. It's increased by 14.8%. So there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity, but it will require continuous reforms at home, and it will require a huge amount of effort both by the private sector and the government of India to think of size and scale and new areas of growth.
So before I turn it to our colleagues here, and I'm going to invite Ela and Nitin and Chandrika and others to come in with their questions or thoughts on this discussion. Another element of the G20 process, of course, is the outreach. And there are, I think we discussed this last evening, and maybe some thoughts on that. Is this also the time when we must actually deepen our engagements with our most important emerging markets or developing countries, such as Africa, make them part of our processes, make them part of our thought process, our neighborhood, the island nations. And how do we approach that? That's one part. And the second is, how do we bring a whole of India interest in the process? Rather than it being seen as a Delhi-driven global event, how do we mobilize the streets to participate in what has largely been accused of being an elite forum, the G20? How do we close the gap between the young India and the India on the streets with this elite discussion?
So there are two components to this, which we must understand. One is what in common parlance you'll talk as track one, which is what government drives, and that is through working groups. The Sherpa track and the finance track. And there are 12 working groups in the Sherpa track. There are 6 or 7 working groups in the finance track, where we drive, different ministries drive it, and that's through real good content creation. So you have to actually prepare issue notes, which then become the basis of discussions in subsequent meetings, and then there is a zero note and so on. So a huge amount of work needs to be done on content creation. And content creation means that you need to look across multi-sector. Every issue is multi-sectoral. They are cross-cutting issues. You then need to build in an India narrative into the content creation. That's one part of it, the intellectual part of it, where a lot of spade work needs to be done, and where I think we'll require help of all think tanks, including all the intellectuals who've assembled here today. So that content creation is really the key to success, because final communique as issued by the leaders must form a part of much of the India narrative, should come through a lot of very, very dogged hard work, which will come through content, and that bit needs to be done. That's important to my mind. And the second bit is about the track 2 part of it, which is the G20 has a number of engagement groups, vast number of engagement groups. There's youth, there is business, there's sports, there's a vast number, there's think tanks, many, and you can expand it as much as you want. So there's the track 2 part of it, and this is a unique opportunity really to provide a huge impetus to the track 2 part of it. And I really think that in a movement like G20, which is about consensus building, you need to really push the limits on track 2 as well. So that's the second part of it, where a lot of homework needs to be done, and we need to push this through. Now, third part of it is that you involve the whole of India, as the Prime Minister said, is that it's not about restricting events to Pragati Maidan in Delhi. It's about taking the event out. If you're going to host about close to 190 to 200 events, how do you involve all the states and union territories of India, and how do you create 190 different experiences of India? From Ladakh to backwaters of Kerala to, the Indian civilization in Hampi. How do you create different experiences around it for everyone to feel spiritually invigorated and mentally rejuvenated, and physically elevated when you leave India and you go back in Indian? So that's the third bit of it. How do you make everyone an Indian by the time he leaves, goes back, and creating that huge experience of India is the third component of it. So all these are being put together.
Great. So let me now turn to Nitin. I can see you waving hands. So the mic is right there. You can just.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so thrilled to hear this from you, Mr. Kant, because for almost a decade now, I think our governmental system misread the G20 opportunity. And part of the reason why I'm going to sort of have a 2-minute comment and then the question. For almost 10 years, we missed the point, and not for the sake of trying to argue. G20 is the nucleus of a new world order in which we are on the high table. We can't reform the United Security Council. We can't, we can't go with an application form and say, take us in. We should be in a forum where we already are and grow it into the new world order. Unfortunately, I think we misread it. We underinvested in G20. We focused a lot on forums like SCO and BRICS and other things, which I suppose they have some value, but they're not central to India's 21st century story. So I'm very glad that you mentioned this. And if I were to paraphrase your agenda, it seems to be that you want to bring prosperity back into the conversation in India and around the world. So if you were to take that and say prosperity is what G20 is interested in for the next 5-10 years, I think we will be able to overcome the politics of anxiety that is characterizing the global system today. I mean, you talk about climate, you scare people, right? And you talk about pandemics, you scare people. You talk about terrorism, you scare people. Scared people don't make good decisions. You need to have an open, broad, visionary agenda to get people together and create this new world order. So if you're talking about prosperity, I'm with you. You've hit the nail on the head, and my best wishes to you. My question is this. Track 2 is fine. There are all of us, we can jump in and we can talk and we can have forums, etc. What about the core capacity in track 1 within the government? Do you have enough people who understand this, who can respond to your call fast enough? And if not, how are you going to fix this? Because from what I've seen of Delhi and the government, there's just, there's one or two very smart guys doing a lot of work, and then there's a huge amount of people who do nothing.
No, so it's a very, very important question. And let me honestly say that all expertise, all knowledge does not vest in government at all. Secondly, let's be honest that government works in silos. I have never in my life believed that government should do all the work, and therefore I work with a lot of bright and brilliant people, like people who are asking questions right now. So I believe in opening up the government to intellectuals, to think tanks, to the best and the brightest. And I've always gained and benefited, and I think I've enormously gained in terms of intellectual knowledge myself by interacting with a lot of people. So on different areas that I believe are critical to India's story, and critical to driving the agenda of both accelerated growth, of sustainability, of the India's digital story, I will work and let me also tell you that all the different working groups, we've asked them to work with different think tanks, with different experts. Without that input, India will never be able to tell a brilliant, top-class, unique Indian story. And therefore, it's very necessary that all of us work with the best and brightest of the talents available in India.
So can I just extend something that Nitin asked, and I'm putting words into Nitin's mouth because he's going to go to Bangalore and he's going to forgive me. But is this also the moment, and I think I'm extending Nitin's argument, is this the moment, the G20 moment, to perhaps put more muscle into government and, do those reforms that you were mentioning and perhaps build a cadre of experts within the government?
Yeah, Samir, you're not putting words in my mouth. That was my question.
Okay.
How is it that we can use it to build capacity?
Actually, I'm coming in here after having done a stint in Niti where I built up a large cohort of about 350 lateral talents. And actually, my own experience about Niti was that these 350 very bright, brilliant young people from all over the world, they brought in an energy, vibrancy, and dynamism which was unparalleled. And Niti could deliver in a vast range of areas, from green hydrogen to electric mobility to aspirational districts, to improving, outcomes and social indicators. Many of these areas Niti could do, and production-linked incentive, etc. Many of these areas they could do because there was this energy and brilliance of the young generation of India, which had assembled from all over the world. And therefore, I can assure you that we will bring in the best talent from across the world to assist us and support us, both as lateral entrants into the G20 Secretariat, as well as use a vast number of think tanks to take this forward. I don't think that knowledge and expertise is presently in the government at all. Also, different ministries will work with different think tanks, with different experts, but I can assure you that we'll use the knowledge and expertise of a lot of lateral talents and a lot of experts. That is something which I will personally drive.
So let me, from Bangalore, move to Bombay, and let me bet Manjeet in. Manjeet, you had a question, and then Ila after that. So Manjeet, over to you.
Thanks. We know from our own experience that the corporate sector is blissfully unaware of the G20. In Mumbai, they have no idea what it is. We are doing our best to educate them. But you're right, you need to bring the private sector in. These guys can move mountains. So what are you doing to address them? Not the chambers, but the actual corporate sector.
Yeah. So, in the engagement groups, a final decision has to be taken at a higher level on who will drive the engagement sectors, because there are different engagement sectors. We also cannot have a scenario where in some countries where this has happened, that ad hocism has led to absolute chaos during G20. So we've also had a situation where, when heads of states were going, there was totally chaotic scene. Security could not be managed. Several civil society organizations just took over the events, etc., etc. So it's very, very important that the whole thing is managed very professionally. So once this call is taken on the engagement groups, I will get in touch with every single engagement group. I will personally interact with all of them. And I can assure you that we will involve all corporate houses in Mumbai, and we'll make Mumbai far more lively and vibrant than what it is right now. You don't need to worry on that. There's plenty of time. So the dull and drab Mumbai will be made extremely energetic and vibrant.
Ila?
Yes, so Amitabh, I want to take you up on your point on the fact that India needs to grow and that there is adequate capital, and that's really the path where we will be effective even in the G20. And when we talk about growth and investment, there necessarily, as you said, has to be a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. Because look at any of the policies today, the government can, for example, only make regulations. It is the private sector that has to, at the end of the day, cut its carbon emissions. government cannot cut its emissions. It's not the government doing the emissions. Or any of the other, whether it's data protection, it is the private sector that will have to put those mechanisms in place. So with my short experience of Mumbai, I've only been there 4 months now, and of the corporate sector, I find that the private sector is terrified. The corporate sector is terrified. Why? Because of the policy uncertainty. The policy uncertainty is coming from, I feel, and correct me if I'm wrong in that, I'm coming to a question, but first just sharing my experience for a minute, that the policy uncertainty seems to be coming from a lack of a continuous dialogue and a lack of institutional mechanisms to have those dialogues. So if India has aspirations to grow, to become some of, like, as you said, Japan, South Korea, and some of the other fast-growing economies, what we do need to do is to at least have a dialogue, not to say that we have to, put policies in place where whatever the private sector wants, but to have a dialogue so that it can prepare itself. Now, coming to my question, are there any plans to put any such mechanisms in place where, there are multiple sectors, multiple industries, and bringing the private sector into the space of discussing policies before they are actually announced?
Yeah. So your question is very India focused. And one is this, it's important to bring global growth back. It's very, very important. And at the heart of it is India's growth story. And I entirely agree with you that the growth is driven by the private sector and not by government. And government must bring in policy certainty. A lot of work in terms of ease of doing business, many other areas have done, and much of the response of the government to several things, including scrapping of the data protection bill, is being done on the basis of feedback from the private sector. So government is in constant interaction. There may have been shortcomings. I do not deny this, but there is a need to constantly interact with the private sector, constantly get its feedback, constantly change policies. Nothing is forever. Nothing is sacrosanct that a particular scheme has been made and that will remain. It should constantly evolve and change based on feedback from the private sector. Now, as far as the G20 is concerned, let me tell you, there's a whole Business 20 group on which I will personally interact once it's decided who will lead it. There is an engagement group on Business 20, and I can assure you that we'll have several rounds of interaction with each of the engagement groups, and there will be constant feedback. So one key thing which is very clear is that the G20 also provides you an opportunity to interact with your constituents, and based on that constituent, the G20 opportunity, when you're assembling there'll be more than about 40 plus global leaders present during the leaders conference. It's the biggest opportunity for India. It's never happened before that you've had all the 40 leaders plus IMF plus World Bank plus OECD plus ADB plus so many agencies, their heads being present together at one particular place in the world. So this is also an opportunity to constantly get feedback and make changes in India. Constantly change, and I think we'll do that exercise constantly. I can assure you of that once it's decided, the decision on who will lead different tracks is taken, in the next 6 months, I will hold a series of interaction with everyone concerned. Not one, not two, but several interaction, and we'll involve all the concerned ministries dealing with that subject also.
Since you're here, I don't want to let you go. I want to take 2 or 3 more questions, and maybe we can collect them together, and then you can respond to them. So I think let's go to Shikha and Chandrika. Let's pick up these 2 questions, and of course to a friend from Chennai, and then we'll come back to you for a series of questions. I wanted to ask one more. Maybe you can note it down. You have done a lot of work. You were mentioning MITI, and I think technology has been one of your focus areas when you were there, and women entrepreneurship has been another one. I think that's one of the tracks we have not discussed. How can we, our experiences around gender, around inclusion, around banking, around investment, getting them to become leaders. That's one thing I just want you to comment on post the other questions that we take.
Sir.
Can we collect a few?
Sure.
Can we collect a few?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Shikha Bhasin. I wanted to hear a little bit more from you, Mr. Kant, on the reforms that you mentioned, both from a point of view of the political mood within India, how ready are we politically for such reforms? And secondly, while reforms have been a big part of G20 in its entire history, industrial policy is suddenly also becoming a very big reality where more and more countries are looking inwards. So what is a realistic ambition to have to nudge the world towards sustainability-oriented innovation systems and industrial policy?
Chandrika?
Mr. Kant, this is a topic that we were supposed to talk about in the last panel, but we didn't get to, the SDGs. Right? So the SDGs have been pretty badly impacted by what's happened in Ukraine and what's happening now with the financial crisis. Two consequences. One is spillovers, so food shortages, price rises. But the second also, and I think this is more pertinent to the G20, is that what it does is it crowds out the thinking space for some of these more long-term development challenges, which are sort of central to the interests of a lot of the countries that are in the G20. And as you're thinking about the India story, a lot of the India story is solutions that are relevant for other countries. So in what way are you going to be able to ring fence that so that we don't have, because these crises will keep coming, and this next year is very uncertain in terms of conflict, and peace and international cooperation is absolutely essential for the SDGs. The whole agenda falls apart in the absence. So what are some of the things that India can do also as part of this 4-year developing country presidency so that those issues don't get pushed off the table?
And last question is on Mr. Masin.
The right kind of content so that it can be sold to G20. Based on your own experience, maybe also sense and you have right people were there and they were able to contribute to the initiatives of Niti Aayog. If in your opinion some of these are to be also parallelly adopted by the G20, which out of these would you rate as the top 3 most that can be taken up for discussion by G20 for universal adaptation?
Okay, quickly, last question.
Thank you very much.
No comment, only question.
No comment. I'm Nakul Sharma from Climate Action Network, and my query is around sustainable finance and unlocking the potential as India's leader in that regard. The question on cash flows and the question around what not if G20 platform cannot be used to unlock the potential of market. Public finance, sustainable finance, private sector finance, carbon markets, loss and damage. Where is the agenda? Where would India start? So, yeah, very quickly, I haven't built the context for this, but this is my query on agenda on climate action.
Thank you. So, over to you.
Yeah, so the presidency is for 1 year, not 4 years. Let me first put this in. Yeah.
The Troika.
Yeah, so there's a Troika starting with Indonesia, India, and then Brazil. So there's a Troika, which is all 3 emerging countries together. So let me first start with the climate part of it, and because it's very important to understand that the reality of the world today, that there is a Russia-Ukraine war going on. The G7 countries see this as an existential threat, and they are not even willing to socially sit with the Russians in certain discussions. That's the reality. Now, the challenge for both Indonesia and subsequently India will be to push and arrive at certain consensus on developmental issues so that we move much beyond this and drive certain major content to be able to bring certain legacy issues, leave behind certain legacies from India. That is really the challenge. Now you're confronted with a conflict, you're confronted with the post-COVID era, you're confronted with climate issues which are dealt with at COP and so on. And therefore, one of the key challenge will be that on issues of climate change, there are several strands to it. There is a climate finance is just one component to it. What Prime Minister has been talking about, life, and that is individual behavior change. How do you nudge it? Because from COP1 to COP26, the developed world has been putting long-term goals without achieving short-term goals. None of the COP goals that they have put for themselves have ever been achieved, other than India achieving its NDC targets, which it had committed to in COP21. None of the developed countries have ever achieved any of their targets. And then they talk about net zero for 2050, and in 2050 they will say that we go into 2080. It's not for the government, it's for individual citizens to change the world, and therefore the Prime Minister's talked at length about pro-planet people and life, and how individual behavior change is critical. And that is about nudging people to change. And that will become one important component of it. And, circular economies, another component to it, climate finance is a third component to it. Green hydrogen is a fourth component to it. So there are several strands to a new, looking at a completely new green development strategy from another perspective, and what are the components we can build it into it. The second is the whole story about digitization and what India has done through public platform, and how we've allowed private and public to compete on top of the public platform, and how we pushed digital payments, and how individual identity has been used and so on, as compared to the big tech development of Europe and America, and how we are able to tell that for the rest of the world it's very important to have individual identity and use the digitization process through a platform on which private sector can compete, and consent-based data protection will really be the key for the future. That is the second strand, which is very critical. And the third is what was talked about, that in SDG we are far lagging behind. The world is far lagging behind. And how do we accelerate the pace of achievement in SDG? Because COVID has impacted learning outcomes, COVID has impacted health outcomes, and how do we accelerate the pace of achievement of SDG? So these are 3 or 4 key issues which we need to push through, in addition to the many issues that will emerge from the development, from the working groups which are under the Sherpa track. But these are 3 or 4 critical issues. So I think somebody talked about trade, and it's very important to understand the question that was asked, very important to understand that, in G20, see, there is a need. Many of these multilateral institutions were created in the post-World War II Bretton Woods era. They are outdated. They are not designed for to do climate financing. If you ask them to do blended financing, if you ask them to do first loss guarantees, they are not equipped for that. They are not equipped to support emerging markets for that right now. The challenge is that whether this G20, we can use our political capital to drive that in the context of the present reforms, and whether this will be the right for. You can't push all your political capital to drive something which will be very, very difficult to achieve during 1 year of your presidency. So there are certain things you need to look at from a long-term reform perspective, certain things which you should try and push your Indian narrative in all your working groups, certain things where it'll be impossible to arrive at. If you were to say that I want to redefine IMF and World Bank through your presidency, it'll be very, very difficult to get G7 on board fully right now. It's impossible. So you lose a lot of political capital. So strategically, diplomatically, strategically, we should try and achieve what is doable, what is feasible, and push for as much as India narrative as possible during this period. Don't go for the impossibles.
So I think,
but reviving global trade is really the key. Everybody started looking inwards. Global growth is not possible without global trade.
And that indirectly responds to Shikhar. But I think we've had a fantastic conversation with Mr. Amitabh Kant. Let's thank him for joining us this morning and being candid as ever. And thank you, Mr. Amitabh Kant. And hopefully we will take you up on your word, and you will meet all of us many times in the next 1 year as we proceed in the Indian presidency.